Okay, well, I've been a writer all my working life, but I started out in journalism, mainstream journalism. I was the East Africa correspondent for The Economist, dealing with very serious political and business issues. But during the 1980s, I bumped into an incredible story in Ethiopia, which kind of changed the whole direction of my life. And this is the fact that Ethiopia claims to possess the lost Ark of the Covenant. And I initially started looking into this as a journalist, as a kind of background interest, and I started to investigate it on trips to Ethiopia, and I began to discover that this extraordinary, apparently outrageous claim seemed to have some truth to it. And over a number of years, I ended up researching and writing a big book about this, which was called The Sign and the Seal, A Quest for the Lost Ark of the Covenant. And this was the first book I wrote which took me into the area of historical mysteries. Previously, I'd been entirely concerned with current affairs. And having plunged into this huge historical mystery of the Ark of the Covenant, what is it? What is its background? How could it possibly have come to be in Ethiopia? An investigation that took me across history, took me to Israel, took me to Egypt as well as to Ethiopia, took me into issues like the Knights Templar. I was prepared for many more investigations in this field. I realized that ancient history was a huge area of mystery and intrigue, and that mainstream historians were looking at ancient history in a very dull, narrow-minded, boring way. And so to cut a long story short, I went on from researching and writing The Sign and the Seal to a huge investigation that became my book, Fingerprints of the Gods, which was published in 1995. And Fingerprints of the Gods examines all the evidence for the possibility that there might have been a lost civilization, a forgotten episode in human history way back 12,000 years ago or more, and that this lost civilization and its survivors might lie at the origins of better known historical civilizations all around the world. And after Fingerprints of the Gods, 1995 and onwards, I resolved and wrote a series of books relating to this mystery. For example, Message of the Sphinx, that I co-authored with my friend Robert Bauval. Robert is the discoverer of the Orion correlation with the pyramids. Later on, a big book called Heaven's Mirror with my wife Santa Faya. She's a photographer, looking at ancient sites all around the world that are aligned to stars in the sky, or that copy the patterns on the ground of stars in the sky. And then a huge book, Underworld, the result of 6 years of scuba diving all over the world looking for underwater ruins, because my goodness, if there was a lost civilization, underwater is a pretty good place to look for it. Sea level rose by more than 400 feet at the end of the last ice age. And when that book was done in 2002, I kind of changed my direction, and I spent the next 3 years working on a book called Supernatural, which looks in depth at shamanism and altered states of consciousness and the whole issue of parallel dimensions and parallel worlds. I mean, ancient Egypt has been an important part of my life since 1989, which was the first time that I visited there. So I've been visiting Egypt for 20 years, and I would say during those 20 years I have probably made 50, maybe 60 trips to Egypt. I have been privileged and fortunate enough to explore Egypt from the deep south to the north, to visit almost all of the great ancient monuments, to get myself into parts of the ancient monuments that are normally closed to the public. For example, climbing the Great Pyramid several times, getting into the so-called relieving chambers above the King's Chamber in the Great Pyramid. I've just had an amazing series of adventures and investigations in Egypt. It is a central. You really can't approach the issue of a lost civilization, which has been my focus for quite a number of years, without getting to grips with ancient Egypt, with the extraordinary monuments of ancient Egypt, with the amazing scriptures and religious texts that the ancient Egyptians have left for us, full of mysterious references to the stars and to the heavens, full of knowledge and wisdom that seems far ahead of their time. So really, I was lucky enough to immerse myself in Egypt for many years, and yeah, that's why I took part in that documentary series. The country was caught up in a devastating civil war at the time, and also was afflicted, as I think everyone remembers, by a series of terrible famines. So it was there was a sort of epic, dangerous, catastrophic feel about Ethiopia in the 1980s. Some parts of the country were pretty much impossible to get to, or could only be reached by basically passing through war zones. And it was on a visit to one of those parts of Ethiopia, Aksum, in the north of Ethiopia, that I found out for the first time that Ethiopia claims to possess the lost Ark of the Covenant, and I stood outside the chapel in which they believe it is kept, and I talked to the monk whose job it is to guard the Ark of the Covenant. And there was something about him and about the way he described this object and the danger and the terror that he felt for the object that convinced me that this was more than just some sort of superstition or myth, that there was something really quite extraordinary going on here. And as I investigated the subject more and more deeply, I found that the Ethiopian claim really had a lot to recommend it. For example, there was, during the 1980s still, quite a large resident population of Ethiopian Jews. These were the so-called black Jews of Ethiopia, the Falashas, or the Beta Israel, as they are also called. And they and their ancestors have been in Ethiopia for more than 2,000 years, going back to the time before Christ. And they practiced a very ancient form of Judaism. They did not have rabbis. They had priests. Unlike other Jews, they performed sacrifice, which is otherwise forbidden throughout the Judaic world. And they seem to practice a pure Old Testament form of Judaism. And this could not be unconnected to the fact that this country claims to possess the ultimate relic of Old Testament Judaism, which is the Ark of the Covenant. And over a period of many years, I investigated this mystery in great depth and looked at the reasons that the Ethiopians give for saying that the Ark of the Covenant is in their country, and found underlying those reasons a real historical route by which this object could have got to Ethiopia. And in the sideways and byways of the story, also went in to look at the mysterious nature of the object itself, because it actually sounds in a way like a work of technology. It does extraordinary things. It's instrumental in knocking down the walls of Jericho. It causes rivers to change their course. It rises into the air and flies towards the enemies of Israel. It lifts its bearers off the ground. Bolts of fire dart out from it and burn and strike to death anybody they touch. It sounded like almost like some kind of machine. And when I looked into the background of this, you can't separate it from the story of Moses. Moses is raised in the household of the Pharaoh in Egypt. He is groomed as a future Pharaoh of Egypt, and therefore we must conclude that he knew what the pharaohs knew, and that means he would have been an heir to the high wisdom of ancient Egypt, to the magic and the power of the magic of ancient Egypt. And when I looked deeper into the Egyptian background, I found many other objects like the Ark of the Covenant with similar powers that were described in ancient Egyptian texts and traditions. And this led me to the conclusion that we were dealing in a way with an out-of-place artifact here, something technological that had found its way into Egyptian civilization and through that into ancient Judaism. We really need to realize we live in an epoch of global warming now. People's minds are focused on climate change. We understand that the Earth is changing. There is disputed evidence that mankind is involved in causing these changes. But actually, if you go back deep into prehistory, you find that the Earth went through several previous periods of gigantic climate instability. And of particular interest is the last ice age, which set on about 125,000 years ago, and which reached its maximum extent around 21,000 years ago. Now, 21,000 years ago, which is thought of as the Stone Age by archaeologists, there were vast ice sheets covering North America and Northern Europe and many other parts of the world as well. In the case of North America and Northern Europe, these ice sheets were more than 2 miles deep. In some cases, they were 3 miles deep. If you envisage New York State, then you should envisage 2 miles of ice sitting on top of the landscape that we see today. These were truly staggering ice caps that built up in Northern Europe and North America. And then for reasons that we don't understand, these ice caps went into meltdown. Now the meltdown, the entire process of melting down the ice took about 10,000 years. But within that 10,000 year period, there were 3 episodes of very rapid warming and melting, where huge amounts of meltwater were flushed into the oceans all at once, where you might have witnessed a 30-foot rise in sea level virtually overnight, where gigantic flooding took place as water poured down off the ice caps and over the land before it reached the sea. The Scablands of New Jersey and the Finger Lakes of New York State were caused by these runoff floods from the ice caps. It was truly a cataclysmic period in the history of the Earth. And in addition to the melting ice, the rising sea levels, there were also a huge amount of volcanic and earthquake activity all around the world at that time. And it all comes to a peak around 12 or 13,000 years ago. And weirdly, this is exactly the same time period that, for example, Plato gives us when he speaks of the lost continent of Atlantis. Everybody's heard of Atlantis, of course, but perhaps not everybody knows that the earliest surviving reference to Atlantis comes down to us in the works of the Greek philosopher Plato. And that when you look at the period of years before his own time that Plato is saying Atlantis existed, you find that he's saying it existed, that it was destroyed about 12,000 years ago. And that is at the peak of the meltdown of the last ice age. So somehow Plato appears to have had genuine scientific knowledge about this catastrophe that hit the world 12,000 years ago. And indeed it is a catastrophe. Whatever caused it, and we can't be sure of that, it is a catastrophe that was large enough to have swallowed up an entire civilization. Sea levels altogether rose by 400 feet, more than 10 million square miles of land, that's bigger than Europe and China added together, went under the sea. The face of the earth was changed utterly, and I think we need look no further than those events to find the source of the flood myths that are told all around the world. For the story of the flood of Noah, hundreds of stories that are told all around the world of a gigantic flood that destroyed a former golden age and that pushed mankind almost back to as Plato put it, that forced us to begin again like children with no memory of what went before. And that's why I often refer to the human race as a species with amnesia, because I think that we forgot a whole episode in our story at around that time, and that it is indeed possible that a high civilization was flooded by rising sea levels at the end of the age and disappeared from human memory almost entirely. When you look at the human story as scientists understand it, the human career, if you like, it's roughly a 6 million year story from the last common ancestor with the chimpanzee through until you reach anatomically modern human beings who look just like you or I. Now, the earliest surviving skeletal remains of fully anatomically modern humans so far found date to 196,000 years ago. That's like 200,000 years ago. And those creatures were physically identical to ourselves. Their brain was the same size as ours, as far as we can tell, had the same structure as ours, and yet their behavior was incredibly dull and primitive. Indeed, almost all of the 6 million year story of human evolution is a story of just unbelievable boredom and stupidity, to be honest. Our ancestors were incredibly dull. There is no evidence of any lateral thinking, no symbolism, no evidence of any form of spirituality or of any interest or beliefs in anything other than the here and now. And this continues long after our ancestors reached full anatomical modernity. And then very, very weirdly, all over the world, and it's really actually after 40,000 years ago, it's as though a light has been switched on in the human brain everywhere, not exactly at once, but in a kind of cascade that spreads out across the world, and you suddenly realize that you're dealing with creatures that don't only look like us, but they also clearly behave like us and think like us. And that's when you find the first great works of art. There was no art before this, and suddenly amazing works of art are being painted in caves and in rock shelters all around the world. At the same time, our ancestors start burying their dead, and they bury them with what are called grave goods, with food and with water. And when people do that, it means that they believe that some essence of the individual survives or transcends death, that physical death is not the end. They have a concept of life after death. And at the economic level, their hunting strategies, their whole way of organizing their lives becomes much more efficient. So it's just a very radical, dramatic change that takes place in the human story after 40,000 years ago. And what documents it are these incredible rock and cave paintings. And amazingly, all around the world, the cave art, the rock art, has astonishing similarities, as though they were all relaying or documenting the same experiences. And so I thought it was interesting to look at the origins of cave art and to see whether there was information in that art which would give us a clue as to what happened to our ancestors at that time. And this investigation, which became my book, Supernatural, led me to look at surviving hunter-gatherer societies, for example, in southern Africa and in the Amazon, where indeed their shamans produce works of art that look exactly like the painted caves almost 40,000 years ago. And in the case of the shamans, we know why they're producing this art. Because the fundamental defining characteristic of shamanism all over the world is the embracing of deeply altered states of consciousness. And it is in these altered states of consciousness, whether brought about by the consumption of visionary plants, as is the case in the Amazon with the amazing visionary brew known as ayahuasca, the vine of souls, or whether through the performing of a certain kind of dance, as in South Africa, where the Bushman shamans will dance for up to 24 hours around a fire until they sense their spirits leaving their bodies and rising into the heavenly realm. The common factor all over the world is altered states of consciousness, that the shaman is an individual who detaches himself or herself from this world, from the physical realm, from the material realm, and embraces the realm of spirits. This is the common factor. And what shamans are doing when they create art is they are documenting and painting and drawing what they saw when they visited those parallel realms and worlds in deeply altered states of consciousness. And so it's not a big jump from there to realize that our ancestors in the Stone Age, in the painted caves, were also using altered states of consciousness and were documenting the experiences that they had. And this led me to examine the radical proposition that what is experienced in certain altered states of consciousness may indeed be parallel universes, parallel worlds, that our senses are normally focused on this physical life on this planet, but that it is possible for us to open up our perceptions to a much wider level of reality. Well, yes, within a space, I'm definitely taking it deeper and further. I think what I call the nuts and bolts explanation of alien contact is actually too simple and not mysterious enough to explain the phenomena. I think that what the human race has been dealing with for at least 40,000 years has been contact with other dimensions of reality. Yeah. Not physical beings just like us who have crossed the distances of interstellar space in order to influence us, but beings who have crossed time and who have crossed the veils between dimensions in order to make contact with us. And that's why the experience is so difficult to pin down by modern mainstream science, which likes to weigh, measure, and count things. We're dealing with a very slippery phenomenon here, something that's extremely difficult to control or repeat unless you use altered states of consciousness. And unfortunately, modern Western science is very afraid of altered states of consciousness and actually admits that it knows nothing about the mystery of consciousness at all. I see our consciousness as a kind of instrument which can be retuned to perceive different levels of reality, and I think that's what shamans have been doing for tens of thousands of years. And that's why the subtitle of my book, the main title is Supernatural, but the subtitle is Meetings with the Ancient Teachers of Mankind. Yeah. Because I believe that we have indeed accessed other entities, other beings who have had teachings to give us, and who indeed still do have teachings to give us. The shamans in the Amazon who view these entities as spirits receive teachings from them all the time, which remedies. Really, an element of this that particularly struck me, and I'll cite it here, is the work of Dr. Rick Strassman. I don't know if you've ever had Rick on your show, but Rick is a medical doctor, a psychiatrist at the University of New Mexico, and he conducted the first work with human volunteers and a powerful hallucinogen to be approved by the U.S. government for more than 20 years. Back in the 1990s, Rick gave dimethyltryptamine, DMT, to human volunteers at the University of New Mexico. And it's really astonishing, the reports that these volunteers came back with from their experiences. Firstly, although they weren't comparing notes, it became clear that they were encountering the same entities, the same beings, in deeply altered states of consciousness, with often the same messages to teach. And secondly, that these beings that they encountered, we know that these volunteers were not physically abducted to any spaceship anywhere. They were lying on a hospital bed in the University of New Mexico in front of a medical team. Their bodies didn't go anywhere, but it appears that their consciousness in many cases was abducted and taken into a realm that was astonishingly similar to the realm of UFO abductees, of people who believe they'd been abducted by aliens in flying saucers. And it raises the question as to what indeed these experiences of abduction by aliens are. Are they simply nuts and bolts physical beings like us who cross the universe in a flying saucer to abduct us? Or are these vehicles, these flying saucers, perhaps are we dealing with some means of interdimensional travel, which operates almost entirely, not completely, but almost entirely at the level of consciousness? And to me, that's a much more interesting and potentially fruitful realm of inquiry. And so I went in depth into that in Supernatural and broadly compared the experiences that shamans have with the beings that they call spirits, the experiences that modern UFO abductees have with the beings that they construe as aliens, and the experiences that people in Europe in the Middle Ages had with the beings that they called fairies and elves, who were also in the business of abducting human beings. And I'm suggesting that all of these experiences are actually the same experience viewed through different cultural spectacles. I've been grappling with this mystery since the early 1990s, and I wrote extensively about 2012 in Fingerprints of the Gods, which was published in 1995. And I also wrote extensively in that book about the Mayan calendar and the mysterious nature of the Mayan calendar. And I spent a lot of time researching Mayan culture and Mayan history and prehistory, and looking at this mysterious calendar that the Maya used, which they appear to have inherited from an earlier people. It really is the most astonishingly accurate scientific artifact, the Mayan calendar. It computes more accurately the length of the solar year than our science uses today. And yet it's a work of cultures that existed thousands of years in the past. The Mayan calendar system was so intricate and so accurate that they could project back dates 30, 50, 100,000 years in the past and tell you on which day in which month the full moon was. They were just astonishingly detailed and accurate. And this calendar runs in cycles of just over 5,000 years. It's not linear, it's cyclical. They think about time in a different way from the way that we think about time. And the last, if you like, episode of the Mayan calendar began around 3100 BC, when we convert their dates into our calendar. And indeed it is the case that it comes to an end on the 21st of December, the winter solstice in 2012. And this, in one of the chapters that I explored this in my book Fingerprints of the Gods, the chapter was called "A Computer for Calculating the End of the World," because that's what it seems like. That's what it seems that the Maya are saying, that the end of this epoch of the Earth comes on the 21st of December, 2012. And if you compare other cultures in the Americas, in Central America and in the southern parts of the United States, like the Hopi, or for example the Aztecs of Mexico, you find that they're all essentially saying the same thing, that time operates in a great cycle and that the present cycle comes to an end pretty much now. The Aztecs called it the end of the fifth sun, and they predicted a great movement of the earth would accompany this, and a destruction of humanity. So it's from these kind of mysterious documents passed down to us from unknown antiquity through cultures like the Maya and the Aztecs, that this concern that we may be confronting something that we don't expect on the 21st of December 2012, that's where that concern comes from. And the view that I have on it is really quite a complex one, because it's a complex issue. Firstly, when we're dealing with a culture like the Maya, who were astonishingly advanced and sophisticated and accurate observers of the heavens and astronomers, and whose calendar is a work of truly amazing scientific precision, we'd be very foolish to completely ignore everything they have to say. That would not be a smart thing to do. We have a tendency to believe that our culture is the apex and the pinnacle of human civilization, and that we know everything, and that preceding cultures knew nothing. But perhaps we shouldn't be so arrogant, and perhaps listen with humility to what the Maya have to say. This is one point. The second point is to understand that the Maya spoke in richly coded and symbolic language, and that when they speak of the end of something, they are also speaking of the beginning of something else. And that we need not necessarily imagine that what we're coming up to is some kind of huge-scale global destruction. It could indeed be a complete change in the way that human beings live and operate in the world, a step change that lifts us to a higher level and allows us to begin a new cycle. It doesn't all have to be doom and gloom, but I do think it's true to say that for a new cycle to begin, the old cycle does conclusively have to come to an end. And there are many signs that the way the world has been run for the last 5,000 plus years, the power of elites, the control of cities and of civilization, there are many signs that this cycle is coming to an end, whether we like it or not. And I think the question is only, does it come to an end in a beautiful way that leads on to something positive and good for mankind, or does it come to an end in a bad way that leads to darkness and despair for us? And honestly, I think the answer's up to us. I think the choice is ours. We should be manifesting something more positive, and it all starts with love. I mean, really, the great problem with the human race right now is an absence of an ability to love. There's just too much hatred. There's too much anger. There's too much mean, selfish greed and ugliness, and this needs to change. This is a choice. We don't have to be that way. Human beings have this incredible gift from the universe. We have these amazing brains. The ancient texts say that it's an incredible privilege to be born in a human body, and yet so many of us just waste and squander that privilege. That privilege is the privilege of choice. It's the privilege of knowing good from evil. It's the privilege of knowing right from wrong. We have the choice. We don't have to continue living in the way we've been living. We can make things better. And I think if everybody starts right back home, in their own immediate circumstances, in their own backyard, and starts making things right there, then it can become right in a broad way across the whole world. Yes, absolutely. It played a huge part in ancient Egypt. If you visit the Cairo Museum, you can see the shrines of Tutankhamun. And on the side of the second shrine of Tutankhamun, you will see a row of figures connected effectively through the third eye, through the center of the forehead, to stars in the heavens. I mean, this image speaks beautifully of the ancient Egyptian concern with as above, so below, with the connection of sky and ground, of heaven to earth, of heaven as a metaphor for the spiritual realm, and earth as a metaphor for the material realm, that these two realms cannot be separated or dissected or held apart, that they must be united and joined. This notion is central to what we call astrology today, and it's central to the ancient Egyptian religious system. An attitude of reverent wonder and worship towards the heavens and towards the universe that embraces us and surrounds us. This was at the heart of the ancient Egyptian system, where everything is alive, everything is filled with spirit, everything is filled with consciousness, quite the opposite of the modern, arid, scientific view, which sees matter as dead and lifeless, which sees the sun simply as a ball of fire in the heavens, not as an intelligent, conscious being, which is what the ancient Egyptians viewed the sun as. Truly, it was a civilization governed and ruled by astrology, but not the astrology of endless rote repetition, but astrology of true knowledge and learning and experience that the ancient Egyptians passed down to us. Well, the trouble is that I think if you were able to get in a time machine and travel back to Ethiopia, around 100 or 200 years after the time of Christ, you would find nobody having any problem with that idea. Mm-hmm. That here was an evolution of a religion that had its origins in ancient Egypt. I think they would have been quite happy with that idea. But as time passes, as thousands of years pass, as the bureaucrats and the money men take control of the religious structure, as pride and ego play their part, you find that religious officials more and more want to forget about the origins of their religion and just define things in a way that suits them to this day, and I don't think Ethiopia is any exception to that. Well, yes, the question of, for example, the visionary brew that one drinks in Peru, the ayahuasca, contains dimethyltryptamine, which is a Schedule I drug in the United States. Its use throughout the Amazon basin is actually protected under laws of religious freedom. It's not just that it's not illegal, it's positively legal and encouraged that it should be used, because in those cultures they respect the ancient shamanic tradition. I personally regard it as an outrage of our civilization that our civilization legislates on what we as adults may experience with our own consciousness. This is, to me, it's utterly astonishing that a person can be sent to prison for exploring their own consciousness. We talk glibly about freedom of the individual and respect for adult responsibility in the West. We talk the talk, but we're not prepared to walk the walk. Because the criminalization of these ancient visionary plants, which have aided mankind throughout history, is an outrageous act against the sovereignty of the individual. If I am not sovereign over my own consciousness, then I'm not sovereign over anything at all. And it's a waste of time to talk about democracy and liberty and freedom until we live in a society that respects the rights of adults to make decisions about their own consciousness, including the decision as to whether or not to take a powerful hallucinogen. In my view, this is not the business of government. This is not an area where government should go. Government has no right to get inside my head and tell me what I may and may not do with my own consciousness. So I do feel very strongly about this, and I do feel that there is an illegitimate attempt to control consciousness in our societies, and that this is disguised under the rhetoric of the so-called war on drugs. I personally feel, and many of the shamans, for example, I've discussed this with shamans in the Amazon, where they do have the right legally to explore their own consciousness. Those countries really could teach us a thing or two. And what the shamans all say when they look at the catastrophe that is being inflicted on the Amazon now by Western greed and commercialism, when they look at the chaos and misery and confusion in the world, the wars that are breaking out, the imminent danger of even nuclear war, for example, in the Middle East, the horrendous pollution that is being pumped up into the atmosphere by our industries and technologies. When they look at all of this, and they look at the terrible, truly terrible role that Western civilization is presently playing in the world, their answer to it is simple. That the problem in the West is that we have severed our connections with spirit. We have cut ourselves off from the spirit realm. And perhaps the only way for us to reconnect with the spirit realm on a wide enough scale for it to make any difference is offered to us by precisely these sacred and visionary plants that come out of the Amazon, or for example peyote in the southern states of the United States, that offer us the opportunity to reconnect. And it's precisely these plants that are held to be illegal, the use of which is criminalized and demonized by our society. And they feel that we need to make a change in that direction if we are to step back from the edge of the abyss where we're standing now and reconnect with spirit. Well, what's coming up is a novel. I've been writing non-fiction, factual books about historical mysteries for the best part of 20 years now. But for the last 2 years, coming on 3, I've been sitting writing my first novel. It's a fantasy adventure time slip novel with one character 24,000 years ago and one character today who are connected with one another and must join together to fight a battle of good against evil. This book, well, it'll be published in the UK first in April next year, and in the States a little later in the year. Okay, well, I've been a writer all my working life, but I started out in journalism, mainstream journalism. I was the East Africa correspondent for The Economist, dealing with very serious political and business issues. But during the 1980s, I bumped into an incredible story in Ethiopia, which kind of changed the whole direction of my life. And this is the fact that Ethiopia claims to possess the lost Ark of the Covenant. And I initially started looking into this as a journalist, as a kind of background interest, and I started to investigate it on trips to Ethiopia, and I began to discover that this extraordinary, apparently outrageous claim, civilization, a forgotten episode in human history way back 12,000 years ago or more, and that this lost civilization and its survivors might lie at the origins of better known historical civilizations all around the world. And after Fingerprints of the Gods, 1995 and onwards, I resolved and wrote a series of books relating to this mystery. For example, Message of the Sphinx, that I co-authored with my friend Robert Boval. Robert is the discoverer of the Orion correlation with the pyramids. Later on, a big book called Heaven's Mirror with my wife Santa Faya. She's a photographer, looking at ancient sites all around the world. For many more investigations in this field, I realized that ancient history was a huge area of mystery and intrigue, and that mainstream historians were looking at ancient history in a very dull, narrow-minded, boring way. And so to cut a long story short, I went on from researching and writing The Sign and the Seal to a huge investigation that became my book, Fingerprints of the Gods, which was published in 1995. And Fingerprints of the Gods examines all the evidence for the possibility that there might have been a lost, seemed to have some truth to it. And over a number of years, I ended up researching and writing a big book about this, which was called The Sign and the Seal, a quest for the lost Ark of the Covenant. And this was the first book I wrote which took me into the area of historical mysteries. Previously, I'd been entirely concerned with current affairs. And having plunged into this huge historical mystery of the Ark of the Covenant, what is it? What is its background? How could it possibly have come to be in Ethiopia? An investigation that took me across history, took me to Israel, took me to Egypt as well as to Ethiopia, took me into issues like the Knights Templar. I was prepared that are aligned to stars in the sky, or that copy the patterns on the ground of stars in the sky. And then a huge book, Underworld, the result of 6 years of scuba diving all over the world looking for underwater ruins, because my goodness, if there was a lost civilization, underwater is a pretty good place to look for it. Sea level rose by more than 400 feet at the end of the last ice age. And when that book was done in 2002, I kind of changed my direction, and I spent the next 3 years working on a book called Supernatural, which looks in depth at shamanism and altered states of consciousness and the whole issue of parallel dimensions and parallel worlds. I mean, ancient Egypt has been an important part of my life since